Hello everyone, welcome to my channel once again. Friends, in this video, I'm going to talk about the wholesale price index and consumer price index. Before I give you the glance of the slides, I just want to mention that we have discussed about inflation in the last video, and we have understood that inflation is a phenomenon, is a process where we find there is a rise in the price of goods and services, and the economic health of any country is essentially judged through some measures, and one such measure is the level of inflation or the rate of growth in inflation. Now, how do we know what is the rate of inflation growth, or what is the inflation that is prevailing? For this, we need to have some quantitative measures. We need to have some numerical value which will guide us to know the inflation, the degree of inflation that is prevailing in an economy. And generally, it is the price index or the price level changes which tells us about the inflation rate that is prevailing in a country. We have two set of indices. One is the wholesale price index, the other is the consumer price index, which gives an indication about the country's cost of goods and services. In other words, it gives a reflection about inflation. Now, first we will see what is wholesale price index, how it is computed, and then we will talk about the consumer price index and its computation. So let's proceed. Now we know that that wholesale is nothing. Wholesaler is a middleman who stands between the producer and the retailer. So he is a person who buys in bulk quantity and resales in a bulk quantity. So he purchases in larger volume and sells in larger volume. So when we say wholesale price index, we are referring to what is the cost of the goods that are purchased in bulk and sold in bulk. So we are talking about those businesses that are engaged in the purchase of bulk commodities and resale of bulk commodities, and what is the cost of that? What is the average price of a basket of those goods which are purchased in bulk quantity and sold in bulk quantity? And that is nothing but wholesale inflation rate or wholesale price index. So see, as you can see in the first point, it is mentioned WPI is a measure of country's wholesale inflation rate or inflation for goods traded in bulk quantities, and WPI or wholesale inflation rate for a basket of goods that are traded by the businesses amongst one another. So as I have already mentioned, wholesaler is a person who stands in between the producer and the retailer. So it's the exchange of goods between businesses. Consumers are not coming in this link. So WPI represents the business aggregate price of wholesale goods. So WPI is essentially the aggregate price of wholesale goods. And just to simplify it for your understanding, that if there is a basket, okay, which comprises of different types of goods, so, and those goods which are purchased in huge quantity and sold in huge quantity, and in that basket we have put several kinds of goods. And when we take out the average cost of that basket or average price of the basket, that is the cost of that wholesale cost of that basket. And if we compare it with some other year, then we can find out the rate of growth in the prices or the cost of that basket, and that is what is called wholesale price index. Okay, so WPI represents the business aggregate price of wholesale goods. Now, who is the authority in our country? Which is that authority which computes WPI? It is the economic advisor in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry of Government of India. So, in India, it is the economic advisor under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry which publishes the wholesale price index. So when WPI is more, we can understand there is inflation. When WPI is less, there is deflation. Now, how it is computed? So for WPI, we have to first understand what is a base year. Base year means a year which is considered to be taken as a base period against which the price changes will be compared. Suppose we are in 2024 and I take base year as 2020. So I will consider what is the change in the price or average cost of the basket in 2024 in relation to 2020. So that base year is the year against which we compare. So suppose it is 2011. in our country. So base year is considered to be 2011. Then what we have to do, we have to find out the current price of the basket and divide by the base year's price of that basket and multiply it with 100. So current price divided by base year's price multiplied by 100 will give you WPI or wholesale price index. So remember, in this index there are 697 commodities. Now, which are those commodities? So, there are three categories of commodities which are included in WPI. First one is the primary commodities. The primary commodities include food and non-food items. So, food items include milk, meat, fish, eggs, cereals, paddy, wheat, pulses, fruits, vegetables, etc. Whereas under non-food articles, we have oilseeds, minerals, and crude petroleum. The next broad category is fuel and power. Under this, we have diesel and LPG. And the last category is the manufactured goods. And friends, this is the largest share in the basket. So, it comprises of textiles, paper, apparel, chemicals, cement, plastic, metals, etc. So, these are the three categories of commodities that are included while calculating the wholesale price index. Now let's talk about the weightages. Weightages means which has a higher proportion. So you can see manufactured goods has a highest proportion of share in the basket. It is 64.23%, followed by primary articles which share is 22.62%, and the last is fuel and power which comprises of 13.15%. Now, what are the uses of WPI or wholesale price index? As I already told in the beginning, it is a measure or it is a reflection of country's level of inflation. If I have to talk about inflation, I will take into account what is the WPI, what does the index says. Okay, how much percentage growth in the price or change in the price level is there as per the wholesale goods. So who are the users of this index? It is generally the government, because government has to formulate its policies based on the level of inflation. Banks and financial institutions will determine its rate of interest based on the WPI. Industries, companies and other businesses, policymakers, media, researchers and citizens like you and me should also know what is WPI. Why? Because they have certain uses. Let's see what are the uses. We need to track inflation with the help of WPI. Trade, monetary and fiscal policies are also formulated based on what is WPI, and it is a deflator of GDP. When we have GDP value, we need to deflate it. Okay, we need to deflate it because with due to inflation, the value of the gross domestic product may be fallacious. So we need to deflate it, and as a deflator, WPI is used. For what is deflator, we can have a discussion in a separate video. But for time being, you can just keep in mind that GDP needs to be deflated for several purposes, and WPI is one such ways by which we can deflate the GDP. Now talk about some facts. In September 1974, we had the highest inflation, that is in terms of WPI. That is estimated to 34.68%, whereas in May 1976 it was around 11.31%, that is lowest ever. Now talk about fallacies, means what sometimes WPI suffers from certain limitations. The first limitation, as you can understand, that there are certain commodities like fuel, power, then manufactured goods, they have their own inherent risks. Okay, there is price fluctuations which are quite natural for each of these commodities. So this is one. Then different countries, if I have to measure the WPI and compare it amongst countries, that will not be a right way to do the things, because WPI for our country includes these categories 1, 2, 3, whereas in some other country they may have different sort of commodities included to calculate WPI. So that makes a huge difference. So you cannot compare if you have WPI of different countries, because they have different set of articles to be considered. It does not include service. So please take care of this fact that WPI does not include service. It takes into account only goods. This is one major limitation of WPI, and not a good measure for service dominated economies. If there are economies which has a greater proportion of GDP coming from the service sector, and if WPI is measured, then it will not reflect the true thing, because you are not including services, you are just considering the goods. Talking about the next, that is consumer price index. So just as I said, WPI is the price level changes for those goods which are purchased in huge and quantities and sold in huge quantities, generally by the wholesalers. Here it is those goods which are purchased by common man, the final users, the end users of the products, the consumers. So CPI estimates, CPI means consumer price index estimate, is an estimate of price levels of various goods and services in economy purchased for mass consumption. Okay, it's not for industrial use or resale, rather it is for mass consumption. So it represents the general changes in the pricing of consumer goods and services over a period of time. Now, which is that authority in case of India which publishes CPI? It is the Central Statistics Office under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and by the Labour Bureau, which is under the Ministry of Labour and Employment. Now, how can there be two authorities publishing CPI? It's because in our country we have four sets of CPI. One is for industrial workers, the second one is for urban non-manual employees, the third one is for agricultural labor, and the last one is for rural workers. So friends, for the first, that is industrial workers, and for the agricultural laborers, as you can see, the category 1 and category 3, it is published by the Labor Bureau, whereas category number 2 and category number 4 is published by the Central Statistics Office under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Now question is, what is its coverage? Means in case of WPI we have seen there are there are three categories which are included for the calculation of WPI, whereas when we compute the CPI there are 8 different categories: education, communication, transportation, recreation, apparels, food and beverages, housing and medical care. These are the 8 categories that are included under the calculation of CPI. So friends, CPI has this list of goods and services that are being considered for calculation of the index. Now, how do we calculate the index? Cost of the market basket in a given year. I'll find out what is the basket of consumer goods and services in some year, say for example 2024, and I will divide it with some base year's price, say for example 2012, and then multiply with 100. I will get consumer price index. So what are the steps? First, we need to select a base year, select a market basket. That means the basket should include those 8 commodities. Record the price for the 2 different types, that is for the base year and for the current year, and match it. Means the current year divided by base year multiplied by 100, you will get what is CPI. It's an example in this table. You can see 2015 is taken as a base year, and there are prices which are ranging from 14 to 2019. You can see CPI is calculated by how? 25 divided by 25, because our base year is 25, multiplied by 100. So you will get 100% price level change. Then you can just check 30 divided by 25 into 100, it will be 120. 40 divided by 25 into 100, 160. So this way you can go for calculating the consumer price index. But if you are interested to know what is the price level change between 2 years, so you can go for year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1 into 100. For example, if you want to know the price changes between 16 and 17, it's quite logical. We will minus 40 minus 30 divided by 30 into 100. Now let's move on and see some facts. Now the friends, it's your task to find out what is the current rate of inflation. It's because this rate will vary depending on which time period you are watching this video. Now let's go on to find out what are the uses of CPI, because CPI is ultimately talking about the consumer price. So it talks about our purchasing power. How much goods I can purchase or services I can purchase with a given amount of income. So CPI will tell. So it's also a barometer of economic health and government economic policy, because in the start of the presentation I told you, as we need to measure the economic performance, we generally refer to the degree or the level of inflation, and CPI tell us what is the economic health. Those countries which has a controlled level of price changes and will indicate a better performance, and also would have give a reflection about a very prudent, very efficient government policy. Now there are also some fallacies, there are some problems with CPI. Okay, now CPI considers urban and does not consider rural consumers consumption pattern, because we have one CPI which is for urban workers, manual workers, but we don't have for rural consumers. It does not consider every aspect that impacts standard of living. We have just 8 categories of goods and services included, but in life we have different sets of goods. There are unlimited number of goods and services that we are exposed to, so those are missed. In many of those goods and services are not taken care of. Does not generate estimates for subgroups in a population. So in a population there may be different subgroups, so these subgroups are heterogeneous, they are different in terms of their choice, in terms of their income, in terms of their purchasing power. So these subgroups are not considered in this type of computation. So this slide will give you a better understanding of how WPI and CPI are different. So you can see that CPI tracks the wholesale price level change, whereas WPI tracks the wholesale price level change, whereas CPI takes into account the retail price level change. Who is the publisher? In WPI it is the economic advisor, whereas in CPI it is the CSO and LB, that is Central Statistical Office and Labor Bureau. Frequency of publication, so weekly it is published, that is WPI, whereas it is monthly publication in case of CPI. What is our base year? Currently 11 and 12, whereas in CPI it is 12. There are 3 broad categories of items under WPI, whereas there are 8 categories of items that under CPI. Now in case of WPI, it is the price is paid by manufacturers and wholesalers, whereas in case of CPI, it is the end user or the consumer who is purchasing the goods and services. So friends, for further discussion to know the practical application of sub CPI, WPI, how they are an indicator, we can refer to the Sri Lanka's economic crisis, the inflationary scenario of USA and UK. So this way you can further improve your understanding about inflation. That's all for today, friends. I hope you could at least get an idea about what is inflation. See you in the next video. Bye bye.